Good evening. This is Michael Cunningham, and I'm being joined today by two prestigious people who are very interested in Armenian history, and they're going to talk a little bit about the times and tribulations and trials of the in Armenian history that takes place on the streets of Berlin and places all over the world right after the Armenian Genocide. I'll introduce our first person first, Michael. Michael, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you got interested in this, and we'll talk to Ara, and then we'll go back and forth, okay?
Excellent. John, you're full of surprises. I don't know if you know well, I'm not going to presume anything. I'm just going to introduce myself. Sorry, I am fiddling with my phone. John, how did you come across me again?
Well, it's Michael, but I came across you a couple years ago.
I mean, Mike Cunningham. Sorry.
Yeah,
Forgive
no
me.
problem. No, it's okay. I came across you a couple years ago when we were working together on the deal for a Law Day deal, and we were working on a grant, trying to get a grant to for about Armenian history here in
And
Texas.
your other guest happens to be the third person of significance that I met in this process.
Yeah.
So let me rewind back to that. In
Okay.
2017, I was working at a Hollywood TV show, and as is normal in Hollywood, your gig comes to an end, and then you find another show to jump on, or you do something like I did. I prayed to God to give me direction in my life because I'm a Christian in Hollywood. And to make a long story short, I sat across from a potential investor that told me, I'm not sure if this is true, but I heard that Armenia is the first Christian nation. You should look into Armenian Genocide movie. Those two phrases, first Christian nation and Armenian Genocide movie, out of a 2-hour conversation and thousands and thousands and thousands of words exchanged, those two phrases, like as soon as they were uttered, they stuck in my brain. It was like I don't remember another word that was said other than those two phrases. Two phrases I'd never heard since I became a Christian, a born-again believer, when I was 18 years old. I had a radical transformation. I was a drug addict and an alcoholic. And I don't know who your audience is, but I'm going to be straightforward with how this thing came together. I saw direction from God, and I came across a guy told me the words first Christian nation. And as a Christian, I had never heard that phrase. And it was mind-boggling to me that as a Christian at that time for 30 something years, I had never heard that phrase, first Christian nation. It's a historical data point that no preacher had ever uttered to me, but it was a potential investor saying it. He said, Armenian Genocide movie was the next phrase. So I left that meeting and I got in my car, and the next day was going to be my last day at work. And I was just checking. Well, actually, I decided to check my headlines before. Literally, I walked downstairs from that meeting. It was in Glendale. I walked downstairs from that meeting, get in my car. This guy didn't buy any of my ideas, but he pitched to me, First Christian Nation, Armenian Genocide movie. I get to my car. First thing I see, this is late September 2017. The very first 3 words that I see in my news feed, Armenian Genocide movie. Like I had just heard those 3 words uttered to me. I heard them, and now I was seeing them with my eyes fixed on this headline. And it was about a documentary that Montel Williams and Dean Cain had helped produce, and it was fighting to get advertising in Glendale. And that was what the article was about. It was just an article about an Armenian genocide documentary. But the timing of that headline mixed with a guy pitching this to me, I took that as God speaking to me. A week later, I was at a bookstore in Glendale. I came across, well, my coworker at work that was an Armenian producer took me on Wikipedia, told me about the ARF. She said, these are my people. I saw 100 years ago a bunch of guys in bandolero bullet belts and rifles. And I'm like, there's a hero story here somewhere. Come across on Wikipedia, Talaat Pasha assassinated by Soghomon Tehlirian on March 15th, 1921, acquitted on June 3rd. and he lived to tell about it. And then just a little bit of research turns out the hero of this story wrote his own memoir. And I go to the Armenian bookstore in Glendale, Abril, and talk to Arno Yeretsian. And I'm like, this is a crazy story. I'm a Hollywood guy looking for something to do with my life. And he goes, well, um, here's Soghomon's prison diary, or not prison diary, his court transcript from the trial. First thing I read, then I read Operation Nemesis. And then he said, there's another guy that I know that is connected to this story. His name is Ara Manougian, and his grandfather. That there's one of his books right there. So it was like the second or third book I ever bought was one of Shahan Natalie's books. And he gave me Ara's phone number. This was like the first day I went in there. And within an hour or two, I was sitting across from Ara in Burbank at a diner. And I didn't know anything about this story. And Ara was helping me get, like he was pointing me in the right direction. His grandfather was fundamental in the success of Operation. I mean, he was Operation Nemesis. His grandfather's the most incredible hero, one of the most incredible heroes whose stories have never been told. And he was an important character to Soghomon Tehlirian. Soghomon Tehlirian's story, he's essentially the sacrificial lamb. He's the one who volunteers to go do the deed, pull the bullet, pull the trigger, and lay down his life and become the face of this complex underground operation, right? Soghomon became the Nemesis. Became the face of Nemesis, but he had to conceal it. And Ara's understandable frustration that this story and his grandfather's story has never been told properly. It struck me, and I was moved by it, and I considered Ara a very, like, one of my first Armenian friends. And time went by, and I could go into plenty more details, but my life changed in September, October 2017. And long story short, I've become I've connected with Soghomon's family, and they have essentially appointed me and directed me to represent the Soghomon Tehlirian estate, the life story rights. I'm the curate of a sacred story that hasn't been told. His memoir had never been translated into English when I came across it in 2017. And I found a business partner to invest in the research and the translation. And now we have a literary agent is chomping at the bit to get the family's authorized version finally published. And that's just a sacred task that it's such an honor to have been tasked by the family. I mean, it's humbling. I'll leave it there. I could take up all of our time just talking about the crazy journey I've been on.
Well, no, I appreciate that. That sounds really interesting. All right, why don't you tell a little bit from your side of the story?
Well, I was, as Michael said, my grandfather was I guess he was the architect of Operation Nemesis. So back in 1919, the Young Turks had been found guilty by a Turkish military tribunal for acts of what we now call genocide against the Armenian people. They were sentenced to death in absentia. They actually were on the island of Malta, and even before the trial started, they somehow got onto a torpedo ship called the Lorelei and made their way to Germany. And they were in exile, or in hiding, I should say, primarily in Berlin, Germany. And so when my grandfather saw that there was no punishment being handed down to the perpetrators, and on top of that, Armenia was still at risk of being wiped out off the face of the earth. He was a member of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation at the time. And so the Armenian Revolutionary Federation had their 9th General Assembly in Yerevan, Armenia, in October of 1919. And he went there to present the proposal of what would become later known as Operation Nemesis. It was called Special Mission. That was the original name that it had. And unfortunately, the leaders of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation at the time were playing politics, which most countries do, most states do. We see that even today, even in Armenia today. And they were actually in the process of making some backroom deals with the Young Turks, the very people that carried out the genocide of the Armenian people. And so my grandfather had to fight his way to actually present the idea at the 9th General Assembly, at which time the Armenian Revolutionary Federation leadership basically said that what happened to the Armenian people is a great tragedy, probably the greatest tragedy in history, yet that's the price we paid for our independence. So they basically said, we will revisit this idea or this proposal at the next General Assembly. So my grandfather left there frustrated, as were a lot of people very frustrated, and he began organizing Operation, as we know, Operation Nemesis, the first person to be executed. And I say executed because what they did, what basically, we've talked about this before, Michael, on a previous one of your programs, is the Hague Convention of 1907 has a provision in there for when there's an active war, world leaders and people of that caliber or who support such actions can be executed. And so effectively, Talaat Pasha, who Soghomon Tehlirian was the executioner, was executed by that. But they wanted to make it into a very public affair so people would remember what happened to the Armenians and also demand justice. So there was a court trial. It lasted for 2 days, and in the end, Soghomon was acquitted, and he was immediately deported from Germany without any weight at all. Not even enough time for an appeal from the other side. The Turks were actually trying to contact the prosecutor, but the prosecutor conveniently had just gone on vacation, so they had no success in doing that. And had they, maybe they would have gotten some traction, and it wouldn't have ended as nicely as it did for, you know, for justice in general. Because as I said, it was, in fact, the backup plan was it was carried out based on the 1907 Hague Convention. And so it was a legal execution, but it was illegal, I guess, governmentally, because it would still be considered murder. So that's basically that. And again, I have grown up hearing the stories. I inherited my grandfather's archive, or I should say, me and my siblings inherited my grandfather's archive, which had a lot of very revealing things. And in the background, on my screen background, is a book that we published in 2019 called Betrayal, the Promise Never Kept, Genocide and the West's Secret War for Oil. And basically it tells the story of my grandfather's life in terms of what had happened to him as a child. It covers that. It covers the operation, and it covers a lot of who was actually behind it and what the core motivation was to exterminate the Armenian people. And the title in itself tells you, the West's Secret War for Oil, because at the time, Western Armenia had about 1/6 of the world's accessible crude oil, and the United States, using the technology it had at the time, believed that they were running out of oil. And so the U.S. and U.S. interests actually are the ones that backed the Young Turks to exterminate the Armenians, and they were awarded, after they created Turkey in 1923, which Turkey never existed before. It was the Ottoman Empire, and that was actually Armenia legally, and even recognized as Armenia. It was created into Turkey by the U.S. and the Young Turks, who were again backed by primarily U.S. interests, but also European interests. So that is kind of what this story is about, and the story that I inherited from my grandfather's kind of our legacy.
Okay, so if I understand you clearly, we have this story about the events that take place on March 15th of 1921 in Berlin. And if we go back to that directly, Michael, you've told me the story before, but explain to our and our viewers exactly after Tehlirian shoots him, what happens to Talaat, and how does he break his skull and everything else? That's a kind of interesting story.
Well, being a creative as a profession, being a creative, thing that struck me about this story is the details are way more interesting than anything I could invent or create. And so my commitment was to get to the bottom of as much as possible. So I've done extensive research in the archives with both Armenian and Turkish historians, and I've got, Harvard and Yale people involved with the, confirming of information and data, et cetera. But what do I bring, right? If I'm not going to be creative about this, if I just want the facts, where does my role come? What skill set do I have that makes, that adds to the telling of Soghomon story? And it's honestly, when I look at his memoir and how well it's written, people that we've allowed to read the translation, we had the best possible translator from Armenian to English do the translation, and for him it was the honor of his life. Ishkan Jinbashian was like, "You're really, I get to do the family's authorized version of the translation." And so when he having the top precision skill set translation of a very articulate, highly detailed memoir. Soghomon Tehlirian was an artist. He was a poet. It's corroborated in multiple discoveries in my research process that he was a teacher by the time he was 17. And part of that, it was out of necessity. The Ottomans would recruit everybody once they turned 18. The military-aged males would be conscripted into the Ottoman army and then put in groups and camps and murdered by their own, co-soldiers. And so Soghomon, there was a shortage of teachers at his school where he was a student. He was in his senior year, the equivalent of his senior year, but he was also made a teacher of the lower grades. And his writing demonstrates that from a very young age, he was very articulate. And when he describes the most important moment of his entire life, the moment he had been given the green light by Shahan, we've confirmed your research, Soghomon. We've confirmed that the man living at that address is indeed Talaat. Now the go order was given. Soghomon left his apartment knowing that he would never go back to that apartment again, knowing that he may not live after this moment, but he was compelled for 6 years prior, compelled on this mission, and here it was, right? And he describes it as, so he runs parallel to Talaat walking down the street. It's a wide street. There's a median in the middle, and he's running parallel. He comes out of his door behind Talaat, and he scurries to get ahead of Talaat. And then he crosses the street to walk towards Talaat. And he describes it that way. And and I haven't seen anywhere else in any other, like some of the graphic novels done, anybody actually recognizing that he approached Talaat from the front and not from behind. He describes it that way. And myself, as a spatial reader, as an artist, I see how he's describing it once I got it translated by this translator. And as he approaches Talaat swinging his cane in his trench coat, and Soghomon with a gun in his coat pocket, he says, right as they were like a step away from each other, this tranquility came over him, as if he were called, like as he had a mission, and now he was called, and he felt called by the spirit of his dead mother, which he testified to, but he also ordered by Shahan Nadali and his authorities. He was called and ordered, but this inexplicable tranquility fell over him. And right in that slow motion moment when their eyes meet, Talaat looks into Soghomon Tehlirian's eyes. And this is Germany, by the way. And this is a Turk seeing an Armenian in a foreign country. And so it must have been quite a shock once Talaat's eyes met Soghomon's eyes, and Soghomon said in Turkish, right, under his breath, "Hey, Talaat." And Talaat, fear filled Talaat's eyes in that instant, but it was already too late. The gun was already pressed up behind the skull. And he pulled the trigger under the left ear, right behind and under the left ear, and the bullet came out right above the left eyebrow. But I've seen the mortician's report, and said in that instant, Talaat's brain turned into a pool of blood. In other words, the bullet created an explosion inside the cranium as the bullet came out. And so Talaat was instantly dead. So what that means is the last thing Talaat saw and knew was an Armenian telling him he was dying for what he had done, right? Soghomon made sure that the perpetrator knew this was the end, and his last vision and thought was OF, right? The equivalent of I am being judged right now. So Soghomon made sure he looked into his eyes and knew what was happening. And then we've seen the contents of Talaat's pockets. I've been into the archive in Berlin where I've held the contents of Talaat's pockets. It's in German, the Mortician's report, but I had a Turk born in Germany who speaks German and my Armenian historian there with me. And he read the Mortician's report and we had the contents of his pockets. Talaat had cocaine and gold bars or gold coins in his trench coat pockets. So he was weighted down. He had gold bars. So the way the mortician describes it is as soon as the brain exploded, Talaat's spine stiffened, and Soghomon describes it this way. He stiffened. He didn't collapse to the ground. He stiffened and swung forward. And so the gold in his pockets is creating that momentum. It's a stiff spine that accelerates as it falls forward, and he was falling forward, and his face and his skull crushes on the sidewalk. In other words, it's going to be a closed casket, ladies and gentlemen. Nobody's ever going to see this guy's face again. And it was the gold that pulled his body, so it was his skull crushed, and then it's pool of blood. And in that moment, Soghomon drops the gun because his mission, his command by his authorities, Shahan Nadali's boss, his boss says, you have to surrender. Don't escape because the world needs your testimony. And so in that moment, nobody knew who this guy was. They thought Soghomon had just killed a German war hero, right? There were assassinations happening at this point in Berlin because they had lost the war and there was kind of upheaval. So it wasn't so much a surprise that a political assassination happened, but the people didn't know who this guy killed. So an angry mob forms quickly and chases Soghomon down. They're pummeling him. He's bleeding. They're literally hitting him in the head with keys. His blood dripping. Finally, the police show up and rescue Soghomon from a killer mob and throw him in the jail. And I'll finish here. The thing, Soghomon has just accomplished the thing he had been called to 6 years prior by his mother's ghost. And he sits in his jail cell and you can visualize the door slamming shut. And he describes his emotion at that moment. He said, I was finally free. Right? You see how cinematic a story this is. He's locked up and could be going to his death, but he was finally free of this burden that had been upon him to bring justice for his mother's massacre. Right? He was trying to get closure for his mother, the most important person in his life. His mother was massacred, and he never found out what happened to her, but she appeared to him in visions. All right. So you can see why me, a non-Armenian, finds this a very compelling story that needs to get told, particularly as a Christian, because of the Christian, it rhymes, let's say, with Soghomon's Christianity. His own story seems like he was called.
Yeah. All right. Could you kind of explain how your grandfather recruited people to orchestrate the justice on these gentlemen?
Sure, I can do that. But before I do that, I learned a very different story than what Michael knows, and most people know, in fact, that's found in the memoirs of Soghomon Tehlirian. And so I should point out a few things. Well, first and foremost, Michael and I have a common. Well, Michael and I both know Soghomon's son, and I don't give his name publicly, and I won't be giving his name publicly. I usually call him Soghomon Jr.
I have to say, we knew
he did pass away earlier this year. But one of the things that he told me, and I can share with you because I have a 3-hour video interview that I did with him. And he, like my grandfather, so my grandfather gave us when we were kids a 6-hour video, or an audio, I should say. In those days, there wasn't video. So that we had the true story based on what they knew. So in the future, we were armed with what we needed to protect our legacy, basically. So Soghomon Jr. shared with me quite a bit, and it was actually me and my parents. We were there together. So what I want to do is actually I can share with you a short video. You won't see his face, but you'll see his hands, and Michael will see familiar things in the background because it's taken in their home. So I'm going to share screen here, and let's see if this works. Hang on, we're on share screen. We're going to do that, and we go share. Okay. Let's do this one. Oops, I gotta go over to this thing here. Okay.
When my mother so during the state, she got close.
Sean used to say that always.
Zurnasting means sit crooked and
line.
speak
A
the
lot of
truth.
the things, I really did Sanskrit of the trial. Afterwards, of course not. My father didn't have a sister. It was much in his sister. No, he went to Istanbul after killed her.
Anyway, wait, Dad, let him tell the story.
I don't think he ever saw his mother. So he never talked about it. So, I mean, they invent things all over the place. And I tell you something. No, I'm going to shock you probably. I shocked you people already this year. I told you when I went to Toronto, when I was invited to this thing, they had a play in the theater. I don't know what they're called. I had to sit through it 2 or 3 times. Yeah. And in the play, they were showing the Turks going to the children. I wanted to puke. I got sick. Believe me or not, maybe it will shock you. I don't see any sense in keeping bringing it back and back and back and back. It's not bringing back my grandmother. I wanted to leave. I couldn't leave. I was a guest of honor. I had to make a speech, and not 1 night, but 2 nights. The play took place. And I'm remembering fine. I mean, even Germans don't do that. I mean, Jews, they think about it, but they don't do that. They don't keep talking about Nazis all the time. Leave it alone, for Christ's sake. Okay, memorial things, service, or whatever it is, but cut it out. What does it bring back? Hate. I don't hate Turks. Why should I hate somebody who wasn't even born when this happened? And you know what people say? You gotta bring it back so it never happens. It's happening every day. As we are talking now, it's happening. Absolutely. I open the Chronicle, and every page, car bomb, there's 40 people, 200 people killed. I don't want to forget it. I don't want to celebrate it or do anything. Now, you're not shocked?
No, I'm not. I've been writing about this for the last month, about we have to put this hate behind us.
You know, in Toronto, you know what I had to do? And I was embarrassed. I wanted to walk away. I couldn't. After the play, they wanted me to.
I'm gonna stop sharing that screen. I'm not super familiar with Zoom, so this is kind of a new thing for me of sharing screen. So as you heard from Soghomon Jr., a lot of the things that happened at the trial and things that, and my grandfather attests to this quite a bit personally to me, and it's in his recordings also, that a lot of things found in the memoirs and in the trial were false. And so, there were certain other things. So let me do this. There's 2 others here. So this is, again, Soghomon Jr. What we were trying to do was, at the time during this visit, we were trying to nail down the original transcripts of his memoirs, which, well, let's hear what he has to say about that. Hang on, I'm going to do share screen again, and I'm going to go share here, and then we go over to this one here. What happened to the transcripts?
Let me ask you a question. Your father's autobiography that he wrote himself, what happened to the original manuscript of that?
That's what your father asked about something that is the same. I remember the sheets like this that my mother added. I think she just, because those were just, they were long sheets like this, not wide. just like that. And he used to at night he'd come home and just write. I don't know what you do. Well, maybe Horian had it then.
Okay. And then before I stop sharing, let me just do this. This is a guy named Bedo Demircan, who also wrote a book about
but we know
hang on.
that
That wrote a book about Soghomon's memoirs, but it's not the complete translation of the memoirs. They were very selective about what they put in. And this is, again, the question of what were his memoirs based off of?
the book was written, the memoir handwritten in early 40s, 41, 42, during the war. And after the war, that Tehlirian had to escape Belgrade when the communists had come into Belgrade, so he had to escape. And he mentions that they had 3 copies with them and they had to leave them in Belgrade. We don't know what has happened to these original copies. And we don't know why or if in Egypt or Husapet, which copy they had, or if they had totally new copy from Tehlirian himself. We don't know these details.
Stop sharing. So basically, what Bedo was talking about were the manuscripts, and in Soghomon Jr.'s video that I have, he also speaks a little bit more about how when they left Belgrade, and that was actually a very interesting story. That story in itself is a movie, I would say. That they left the copies of the manuscripts with a relative. It was the in-laws of Soghomon Jr.'s older son's wife, and they presume that those were destroyed. And basically, in the video with Soghomon Jr., he talks about how he remembers in 1956 how his father was corresponding with the people that, again, Bedo just mentioned, Husapet, which was the publisher, how they were working on this. And he doesn't know, again, if this is of course, Soghomon Tehlirian, he definitely was involved in that. But my grandfather also does mention how there was a man named Bahan Nabasartian, who was the Armenian Revolutionary Federation's top writer. And he basically was the kind of character who was able to put in what he wanted to and take out what he wanted to. So you'll notice in Soghomon Tehlirian's official memoirs, there's no mention of Shahan Natali at all. And there was supposed to be. His name was supposed to be mentioned, it was supposed to be included, but Bahan Nabasartian removed it because Shahan Natali had become the opposition of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, because after about 7 executions, they put an end to the operation. And the operation was supposed to have at least 100 executions, if not 200. There was even a list of 600. So, and these were people that were involved in the Armenian Genocide, and that was not Turks, most of them. They were British, they were Americans, they were all over the world. And these were people that were benefiting from the oil and other minerals that were found in Armenian territories. So that is kind of that. And then let me just do one last one. So as Soghomon Jr. mentioned, half the stuff was made up in the transcript. He knows, that Soghomon never saw his mother, never saw her being murdered, didn't have a sister, and so on and so forth. And one of the other things is, and Shahan was very specific about this, and I'm going to share this video with you. It is in Armenian, but it does have English subtitles. So let me just get back to the share screen, little thing on this screen, and let's go share. And let's go back over here to this one and bring this up. And here we go.
Armenian nişanavır yerek başbakanları sorumlusun. Ya, apana oraya meclisine baktım. Talaat Pasha. Nişanavır. Այդ փաստաբանները քրակերել են։ Դες ինչ աննելու։ Volleyball kafapanları ay panuneyin var. Ay zaman ala göre Spanya'da. Değil. Elbette azad arsan. Germanya'yı meşadak pançıra. Germanagan, çaragan var pançı. Ye para paktikin aynı vurma pançı. Gayseragan. Pançı. Andrade dikçün neçe var. Öyle çakal neçe. Öyle kıslarına gelsin ya. Ye panin tahlicin ileri. Tadaganna hararı. Tadaganna hararı. Panin admeşanabor çanı Germanazi. Lepçi Lepçi kroşe davanı. Tadaganna. Anor tutnunku ait yöretmişini bulduğunu. Ye într-anul tada hazır bu. Karabağ ne? Ait într-anul tada hazır. Az pastapanların ne? Başkan pastapanların artık aşağı yerinde. Açın zıttı da beğendim görmek ister. Keyvanıda oraya bütün panolu badici gıbağın panolu oldu. Hani district attorney. Az hankaman deniyor. Neyse. Yer menal. Buradaki panel ilk patas fanalı aslında yer ağzına şineti. İntegriz kral üstünde çaldı kanadıca. Hiçbir şey yapmadım. Şer'i Mayrus yer ağzısını işlese. Şer'i Mayrus yer ağzısını işlese.
Graziano è più parte negora, si pregherà stessa.
Soghomon da
Soghomon, nero, Soghomon.
Yerel dersin. Yedise yerellik meşmalesi sabır. Tüm Talaat Pasha yetişspannetik. Ününde başı. Talaat Remen bodiyse yakbarlarının merkezinin Armenian Genocide yakbarların Spanyalardan Mayer Spanyalardan işte olmuyor. But hayırnalet Armenişe hayır işte hayır Romanya'yı meşgul ediyor. Kahveyi kanıtını. But aslında ben badmintonlar rekomendüştü. Ampo şampuanı badagayne bu. Tuşkate. Aslında Arantin Remen aslında vali insinkentus sever. Am badat kanadım ediyor. Yani meşgul zıvat bambını. Aşk edini bırakın.
And that's basically Shahan's a little segment of that 6 hour, it's a 6 hour, 15-minute recording of my grandfather telling the real story based on his firsthand accounts. So the thing is, it's such an incredible story as it is, but to tell it with made up stuff, as Soghomon Jr. said, half the stuff was made up. Since we know the real story needs to be told to really give it justice. And it should be noted also, like I said, we believe that it wasn't a matter of religious differences. It was greed, clear, straight greed from powerful people like the Rothschilds and the Standard Oil people, the Rockefellers, and they were all involved. All of those were involved at that time. And the Armenians had something they wanted, just like we see today. We see it in the Middle East. We're going to war right now. Why are we going to war right now? It's not because there's differences. It's because there are minerals. there's oil there, there's energy there, there's things to be, have money made from. It's the same story. Just like Soghomon Jr. said, it's happening all the time right now. And that's our reality. But the story does need to be told. The real story needs to be told so humanity can learn from that. But I hate to say this, but to make it a religious thing, it doesn't give it justice at all. And Soghomon Tehlirian, like Soghomon Jr. said, he never talked about his mother. He barely saw his mother. I mean, he was, out of the Tehlirians, they were separated basically. One in Romania, one in Armenia. The father was in Romania. And so that's the real story, and that's what story needs to be told. And I should add, as I told you, Michael Cunningham in the last interview, that the Shahan Natali's version of the Talaat execution is coming out, and it was something that he wrote in his own words. And it doesn't give all the details. There are some details. There's footnotes in there that are added to fill in some of the blanks, in which, some of the other players that were involved. But when he wrote it, he was trying to protect some of the people that were helping him in the background. And there were a lot of people in the background. A lot of women were helping him, and because the party was against it. The Armenian Revolutionary Federation was against this operation for the reasons I mentioned before.
Yeah, it brings up some, very interesting points. I think maybe go back to a question here, and it was to start with Michael. Michael, why do we need to tell your story now? I mean, why is this story so important? Then we'll ask the same question to Era, because I think that people today really need to hear this story.
Yeah, when I realized that Soghomon had written his first-person account, it boggled my mind that it had never been translated into English. And so I set about finding the best of the best of the best that I could, right, to make sure we were accurate, and that it was a gift. I had mentioned him already before the translator. It was a gift that he happened to be the best. Like, I asked 3 different people, and they all said the same guy should translate it. And it's odd to me to find Armenians actually attacking the integrity of the greatest hero, like the national hero. And I don't know how. I don't want to cast aspersions on people, but a lot of the assertions made, I didn't do a list, and if I had the recording, I could do a long list of things that have all, that Ara began by saying, you can't trust the memoir of the hero, right? You can't trust the memoir of the hero, but didn't really give any substantiation to it. And then, he goes ahead and uses some of that and puts Soghomon's name on his book as an author of his book, a co-author. So don't trust the memoir, but I'm going to use it so you can trust what I have. So there's a lot of politics behind why people would undermine the hero's story. And it's such an honor that the family, Soghomon's son, who knew very, very little about what his father did. Admittedly, he said, I've never read this, because it hadn't been translated into English. The Armenian for me is too difficult. I can read and pronounce the words, but it's such classical, as you and I might say, like Greek or Latin, the classics, right? Soghomon Tehlirian wrote with that depth. And when I asked my translator, I'm like, there's objections to the authenticity of this, right? This is Soghomon's actual personal copy that his son gave to me. Like, Soghomon Jr. Gave this to me and said, I can't read this, but you can have it. It's the last copy my father had in his possession, and I'm handing it off to you. And so when I asked the translator, I said, is this reliable? In our research, we found some of Soghomon's other writings, at least three other documents that Soghomon wrote. And so when you do a comparison, a textual analysis of a person's style of writing and knowledge base, we found Soghomon's prison diary in the archive in Yerevan on our first research trip. And we got the same translator to translate all of Soghomon's writing. And I said, look, can you compare, did Soghomon write this, or is this a compilation of other people trying to, I don't know, come up with some compelling narrative to convince people? And Ishkan said, oh, no, it's the same author. Like this, and I've had a Turkish historian that read the English translation, that read it and had this sudden awe. It was like when you read something that rings as true. First of all, I went with the historians, right? Fact checking, right? I showed every detail in my script that I've written from this to at least 2 historians, and they fact checked it. So as far as inaccuracies, I've got the best translator saying, oh, no, this passes the smell test, right? This is written by the same author. These things happened, right? So you have to start with that. Then you can interpret what's inside of it. Did he really write it? Now, did these things really happen? And that's where the corroboration on 3 separate research trips to 8 countries and 15 archives, corroborating the information. Because as my historians say, you can't rely on just one memoir, right? The most important memoir, yes, is kind of the core, but you have to fill in the blanks that Soghomon didn't know. And so to say that they made it up, there is some standing to say that it was faked, it was corrupt, it was fabricated. Everyone knows the lawyer's embellished testimony. Everyone knows that. To say that it wasn't true, yes, there were absolute lies in the defense testimony, right? Soghomon was not home. He did not see his family die. He didn't have sisters. There's details that they put in there to make him sympathetic to the jury, right? A good defense lawyer is gonna, there's no Google, you can't look these things up and document them. So there were fabrications. So rewinding to my completely objective observer coming to this story, completely objective, not Armenian, I have no dog in this fight. I come to it, I find a hero story, I read the court transcript, I know some of it's false, and I have a memoir that's never been translated into English, and I'm chomping at the bit. Soghomon says one thing in his court transcript. He says, the judge asked him, why did you do it? He said, my mother told me to do it, basically. Yeah, that's like my mother's ghost, right? That's in a court transcript legal document, Soghomon, right? He made up all this other stuff. And I, as an objective observer, coming to this narrative saying, okay, I understand them making up some of this other stuff. But that one right there, the most important person in his life, he was the youngest of 4 boys. His next older brother was 4 years older than him, was off at university, and Soghomon was alone. His father was in a foreign country, and Soghomon was raised in Bagaric and Erzincan. And then he at 17 leaves his mother behind, and he's a teenager. He's like, nothing bad's going to happen. And then war happens, and he doesn't realize until much later that he's never going to see his mother again. The most important person in his life. He goes to war. He's with the volunteers on the Eastern Front, and he gets all the way back to his home. It's turned into a Russian barracks, and he passes out from the trauma. And he has visions, repeated visions. We call it post-traumatic stress disorder today. The dead. Okay. Is that possible? Do people have visions of the dead? That's right. We again need to interpret. Sorry, I know I'm going on. Maybe I haven't answered your specific question.
Mike, you bring up some very valid points. The only thing it'd be kind of weird or think about on a couple of folds. Number one is that I don't know if he had knowledge of all the stuff he was writing about more so than maybe Ara's grandfather who was orchestrating it. So that would
which
be
things though, not having read it, that's a speculation, right? No, this is his
exactly
personal
right.
account.
And
this is what he went through. He doesn't know what Shahan went through. He just details what he went through.
I'm not arguing. I'm just talking about this from point of view, from his heroic point of view or whatever. But the other thing is always kind of made me interested in this case was the timing of the trial itself. It almost had to be set up ahead of time because, within 2 months, less than 2 months of the well, right at around 2 months, I guess you'd say.
10 weeks.
They have a trial, 10 weeks or whatever you want to try to say, and they have the witnesses all ready to go and prepped and stuff like this. So, the story had to be what do you call it? Predetermined, I'll just put it that way, not necessarily,
What story?
Well, I'm talking about the whole story about the idea of the dream, the idea of he's seeing his parents, the idea of putting the Talaat Pasha basically on trial for his own murder instead of that. That's a defense, an excellent case. In fact, so impressive that Raphael Lemke, who was Lemkin, excuse me, was a law student that ends up this in 1948 with the Genocide Convention. He was so impressed by it, he ends up calling genocide or coming up a term from seeing this, and this was by far one of the biggest things in the press in Berlin, and one of the things they study in law cases for the next. This is like the O.J. Simpson case, or better than at that time. So I mean, this was not a spur of the moment type of thing. This was a designed defense that had to take a little orchestration, just didn't come about on itself. So
Right.
somehow or another,
right. Operation Nemesis launched. Operation Nemesis launched at least 9 months prior to the actual, maybe even more than that. Actually, Soghomon got connected to Operation Nemesis 9 months after it was first funded by the ARF. Right? They first passed a legislation, or in their, we have this operation, and so in that 9 months, they're hiring assassins and they're sending Soghomon. They sent Shahan months and months ahead, and so obviously they're planning. We have to kill him. He has to go on trial. He has to have a story. So there's lots of time to prepare a story.
Yeah, and I should interject here also that the story that I should interject that what Michael is telling you is based on the memoirs of Soghomon Tehlirian. But
and the prison
real
diary,
story, there's a lot of
and everything else.
But the story, the sending before the ARF financing and so on, there is a very different story, and that comes out. That is actually part of Memoirs of a Stranger, which is Shahan Natali's version of Operation Nemesis, and it corresponds with his diaries that he wrote day by day. So we actually have the daily diaries. So it's not like he made up this story afterwards. It's really based on. I mean, it corresponds with the diaries themselves that are penned in with ink. And I should also add that. Getting back to the dream, as we saw in that video of Shahan Natali speaking about that was a creation of the German lawyers. And the reason why they had to create it was, and if there's a 16-minute video that's found on Facebook on the Betrayal, the Promise Never Kept group page. And basically, when Soghomon was first interrogated, he basically confessed to premeditated murder. And he was definitely going to be prosecuted for that had they been able to continue that. So what they did was, this dream that they created was part of that to get an insanity plea. And that's the reason why he was not executed or in prison, but he should have.
Incorrect. That's factually incorrect. He was not acquitted for being crazy. It was
not. That's
factually incorrect. You're making false statements. And I don't know who the audience. Mike, I don't know who the audience is, because I come representing Georgetown and Yale and Harvard and all the historians. Like, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm finding the facts. You are representing the family. And it was baffling to me, the family of Shahan Natali was baffling to me, that you would not want your grandfather's story told. Like, you're like,
I don't object to his story being told, Michael. I just want it to be told accurately.
Right. That's why I've gone to Georgetown, to Armenian historians, to Turkish historians, to German historians. I've been in the archives. I've held the contents. I've stood where. I've been outside Talaat's house. I've been where Talaat fell dead. I'm doing the research, right? I'm not trying to make
the memoirs that you're holding, Michael, that in your hand. Yes, it actually says the memoir, the story of Operation Nemesis is not the true story of Operation Nemesis. and something
in the
along
intro, like, yes, there's more to the story, right? Soghomon didn't know all the details. I'm not purporting that this has every detail, which is confusing to me why you wouldn't fill in those details when I said, hey, we should tell Soghomon's story. And you said, no, we should tell Shahan's story. I mean, you didn't say it that way, but I've never met another Armenian that wants Soghomon's story undermined more than you.
Well, no, the reason
story.
why, Michael, the reason why we weren't able to work together is because you said you need to have your mother sign over the life or whatever story rights to me so we can tell this story. Without that, we can't work together. And
Oh,
so my
it's
mother
called
said
it's
no.
called an agreement, right? You have lawyers, they figure it out, right?
Right,
Lawyers
but
figure it out,
but that's
right?
where
And it's
that's
like,
where it's stalled. So, but the reality
it
is
didn't
that
stall.
I
I
also
said that and
have
you went away and
I
I
also
pursued,
have
I continued, right? And the family's very happy with what I'm doing.
I
In
do
fact, this is
also
Zavin's watch. It was not the same one he held in the video, but Soghomon's widow gave me his watch, gave me his ashtray. I have an autograph. You know, it's like they've been giving me artifacts. So they're happy with me wanting to preserve the accurate history.
so
Period.
I also have Shahan's copy, the first edition of Soghomon Tehlirian's memoirs with margin notes, with all the corrections in it. And it's one of the things that maybe one day we're going to publish, but right now
Which
we're
you don't want
concentrating
told.
on.
It's like, why would you hide these things? That's one of my complaints is, why are the Armenians
we're not hiding
this
it.
from the rest of the world? It's 100+ years later. The memoir hadn't even been translated in 2017.
The story
Almost
is
100
right
years
here
later.
in Betrayal of the Promise Never Kept. The story's in there. You've read it. You have
No, there's
you have
pieces of it
Soghomon
in there.
Yeah.
Right. There's actual falsehoods in your book. You say this was not in the original memoir. You put a piece that wasn't, and like every version I've seen has that in it. So I understand the Armenian people having a sacred story and over a century, legends and biases arising and fables, like people thinking, hey, Talaat, and Talaat turned around, he shot him in the forehead, and like all of these different, what happens in trauma, like cultures go through trauma, and together they build up these heroes and they take on these roles, and people who are close to it and involved with it. I absolutely understand the family of Shahan Nodali, understanding how sacred Shahan's role in this is. And for me, the outsider going, yes, Shahan Nodali needs to be glorified. He's only going to be glorified if Soghomon's story is told like Peter doesn't come before Jesus, right? You tell Jesus' story, and then Peter, you understand why he's famous, right? Shahan Nodali, Soghomon Tehlirian was the fulfillment of Shahan Nodali's desires. He wanted Talaat dead. Talaat deserved to die. And Soghomon Tehlirian was the gift that was given to Shahan Nodali. Soghomon was the last person that Shahan spoke with, or Shahan was the last person that Soghomon spoke with before he said, we don't know what the words were, but thank you, my son, for sacrificing yourself for this. It was an emotional moment, undoubtedly, because nobody knew he was going to be acquitted. He's going to his death, and he has to lie. They can't tell people that it's a conspiracy, right? They can't tell that. It's like they had to fabricate things. But just because they fabricated things in a trial doesn't mean that Soghomon Tehlirian, 20 years later, when he finishes his memoir, is like, I'm going to maintain this conspiracy. Just 3 years ago, some letters came public between Soghomon Tehlirian and the editors at Husaper, who were typesetting, right? We've got the memoir, we're typesetting it, and Soghomon's sending them last minute notes. Please update this, change that. That's not a person that's going, we're going to maintain a conspiracy of silence decades later. No, it's a person saying, my story must be told. I want to tell it accurately. And so there are a couple modifications that Soghomon wanted. A couple minor things, something that I mentioned earlier today. There were modifications that Soghomon himself wanted, but in the technology of the time, when you've already typesetted the first half of the book, you can't go back quickly and undo it. So there were a few things that he wanted to change. And one of the things, circling back, I'll conclude with this. One of the things that Soghomon wanted told in his memoir that didn't make it to the final copy, Soghomon was involved with it the whole time. One of the things that didn't make it was him uttering to Talaat. In the court testimony and in this version of the memoir, he doesn't say that he said anything. And that was confusing for me when I came to this. And why are people saying he said, hey, Talaat? Why are people saying that? Why are there graphic novels of showing him turning around saying, hey, Talaat? Because it was something I think that occurred to him as he was meditating on it later. Is I did say something because he responded to me, and it was a almost involuntary under his breath. The way he says to say it, the way he says to change it in the memoir is, he heard me, as if he wasn't saying it out loud. He says, "Hey, Talaat." It was under his breath, and Talaat heard it. And so Soghomon didn't say, "Hey, Talaat." It was, "Hey, Talaat," just so Talaat would fixate on him. And that's just an example. That's what happens in history as we try to document things. We try to get it as accurate as possible. When those letters came out, it also further corroborated that Soghomon Tehlirian was the author of this, that he was involved with it all the way down to the end. The editors were reaching out to him. The editors were reaching out to him saying, corroborate this, corroborate that. And so also the last thing, and I already said that, but to fabricate a ghost story in such a horrific atrocity when these kinds of events happen on a regular basis, and they happen to this day, people having religious experiences, to say it wasn't a religious war, it was greed, I don't know what the agenda is there. It literally sides with the Turks. When you say that, you're siding with the Turks. No, this wasn't about religion. But that young girl, or those millions of young people who at the screams of Allahu Akbar were butchered, they weren't thinking it was corporate greed. They were thinking this was a religious war, that they were dying because of this tension that happens today. And to want to set aside the hero's version of the hero's story is perplexing to me, Ara. I want you on board with what we're doing. I don't know why you would try to undermine Armenia's greatest hero. It's sad, but I'm grateful that we can speak civilly.
Armenia's greatest hero, Michael. I want accuracy, and I can only go based on what I have from Shahan Natali, who was the organizer.
One person.
And the person who hired the attorneys and worked with the attorneys. So for him to make a statement of the dream was made up, and when we say so many other things were made up in the court case, why couldn't the dream be made up? There's no reason why it couldn't be made up.
That was the number one question for me when I read the court transcript. The number one question for me, before I could read the translation, it was frustrating. I'm like, wait, it hasn't been translated? It was 2 years later that I finally had a translation that I could read, because my business partner, when we hired him, got it translated. The one thing that I had to wait 2 years to see with my own eyes, would he have made up a lie about his mother? The memoir will tell the truth. If he talks about it at other times in his memoir, that will corroborate that this was an experience that he had. And when I read the memoir, I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, it started right after the Russians abandoned the war front, and he's in Echmiadzin with 100 orphans lying and crying, and he's been appointed the head orphan gatherer, right? His sacred task right after the war and the genocide was to gather the remnants of the massacred population, looking for remnants of his own family, and taking the testimonies of the orphans, and then having such a vivid experience as they testify about watching their families be butchered. He's traumatized thinking about his own family, and he passes out on the floor of Echmiadzin, the first Christian cathedral. He passes out on the floor and has a vision of killing Talaat. And then it comes back later when I can go in the details. He had recurring night terrors. He's not making up ghost stories. He's trying to rescue his people where there is no justice. He's trying to bring justice. He's not calculating some nefarious spy. He was driven by justice, and miraculously is connected with Operation Nemesis, who put him in the pole position to pull the trigger, fire a single bullet, and change history. Soghomon Tehlirian is the father of international law. By the decision to pull the trigger, to become the executioner, right? The judge and executioner, and then let the jury decide. By pulling that trigger, he gave birth to international law, as Raphael Lemkin will testify, right? Soghomon Tehlirian is a critical historic character by his own decision. He didn't have to pull the trigger. He did. And as a result, that miraculous miracle of jurisprudence, and not guilty. This was unprecedented. This guy deserved to die. He'd been sentenced to death. We don't have laws for that across international boundaries. So Soghomon is an Armenian, and this guy is a Turk, and he's bringing justice that the Armenians have ordered and the Ottoman Empire has ordered, but Germany hasn't ordered, right? Germany is still complicit, and now justice is being served by this one guy, a lone gunman who had to lie about everybody else involved. Well, I want to tell the story of everybody else involved, and Shahan Natali is central to that. It's an exciting story.
I guess it's an exciting story, but I guess you and Shahan Natali will have to agree to disagree on the point about the dream.
Yeah, yeah,
But
because not every human knows everything. Shahan Natali didn't know all the details about Soghomon's experience. You
yeah,
know,
and conversely, I think the opposite would be true too. So this actually becomes a very good story and very timely right now,
yes, sir.
especially with all the stuff's happening here in the United States and all around the world. It appears that we never learn our lessons from any part of history. So the more you can get into history, the better off it really is. And one of the things I was trying to get you guys together today, and I was going to have the um, Armenian priest friend of mine that just retired, talk a little bit about Armenian Christianity, because Christianity has played such a central role in Armenia's life or even existence for all these thousands of years now. I think our explain to a little bit why we say it wasn't really Christianity, and then Michael, if you could just we'll try to end a little bit, talk about why it was Christianity in your ideas. All right,
Yeah, sure. So basically, I mean, my take on this is religion was used as a tool to pit groups against each other. And so when we say that the last thing that these Armenian girls heard, you know, Allah Akbar and so on, when the sword came down on their necks or whatever the case may be, of course they're going to think this was religiously driven. But the reality is, and we see it even today, is that religious groups are being pitted against each other, and different types of groups are pitted against each other for the gains of a few very powerful and very influential people groups and so on. So that's the reason why I'm not saying religion was not used to carry these things out, and it would appear to just the common person that doesn't have access to the archives and access to information about what's going on in the background and who's supplying the weapons and who's profiting and who's being granted concessions deals, mineral concessions deals, and so on. Of course, they're going to think that it's religion. But the reality is, and as it's noted in this book, Betrayal, the Promise Never Kept, it very well documents who was behind it and what their motive was. And even a rear admiral named Colby M. Chester, who was a Christian, talks about how they got rid of the Armenians and how they backed Mustafa Kemal and the Young Turks, and they got these deals and so on and so forth. So it's not a secret. Of course, it was a secret up until the time that a lot of these archives, these government national archives, had to declassify some of these top secret reports that, you know, the Britain talks about it. They had their spies out there. So there was a lot of spies visiting these, like the time when Soghomon had first shown up on the scene in Berlin, Shahan had to make his way out to Rome to go spy on the Turks because there was a big meeting, and the Armenians were also in attendance at this meeting, and it was to bring Talaat back. And in Shahan Natali's version and in his journals, prior to Soghomon even entering the scene, they had already identified the house that they suspected that Talaat was staying at, and they had it under surveillance. And they were taking turns. There were 3 people that he recruited in Germany who were young Armenian Revolutionary Federation members who didn't know that the Armenian Revolutionary Federation had not sanctioned the operation, but because of secrecy clauses, they weren't allowed to talk about it to anybody. So they basically had been brought in under false pretense to carry out surveillance of this location. And eventually they brought in Soghomon, and one of the first things while Soghomon was there was Shahan had to go to Rome, and that's when they first saw Talaat. They called him the train station man, and they saw him in the train station, and Shahan ended up in a compartment on a wagon going to a train wagon going to Rome, and he was sitting in there with some top officials, Turkish officials, and they were speaking Turkish about their plans right in front of him, thinking that he's an English businessman or whatever they might have thought he was. So these are kind of the things that, and Betrayal, the Promise Never Kept does cover a lot of those things that, you know, that I'm speaking of right now. So that's, I mean, basically, I don't believe that religion was the cause of it. It was a force used against the people to say, you know, for common, simple people to be able to be manipulated to commit murder, literally.
Okay, Mike, explain your version of that, because I think there's a lot of merit to that as well.
Okay. To discount the reality of 1.5 million people who are brutally butchered, right? Because he said, as we heard him say, that little girl may have thought that as her life was being, as her body was not on her neck, there were much worse things that they did to little girls, shouting what they shouted. But after describing that, but in reality, right? Rather than her reality, you said, but in reality, it wasn't. And so a person's experience is being completely discounted by saying it was just greed. The fact is, two things can be true at the same time, and they both need to be addressed. And that's why there's some value in the research that you have. Like, there's a lot of value. And that's why I would say, absolutely, I'd love to sign an agreement with you to have access to some of the life story rights of your grandfather, right? That's something I would love. But if you want to minimize his role in what we're doing, fine. There's enough public information out there that, I'd love to have him as a main character. But to minimize by saying, oh, they may have thought it was religion or religious motivations as they're being butchered, right? The last thing that they experience. And if Christianity is true, which I believe it is, right? That's my bias. That's the bias I bring to this. This is a first Christian nation. Remember, I'm only here because it's my history. Being a Christian, the history of the first Christian nation is my history, and I want my history to be accurately told. And here's a Christian hero named Soghomon Tehlirian, happens to be ethnically Armenian, but he is a Christian hero who was on a mission from God, without question, because the fruit, international law, is born by his actions. Because of his actions, we now have something called international law that legal historians celebrated on the centennial of the verdict, right? It was a centennial celebration on the verdict just a few years ago, 3 years ago. Soghomon Tehlirian is a critical historic character. He's a Christian hero, and I actually believe he qualifies for sainthood. Seriously. If Gregory the Illuminator was a saint, the Illuminator saint, Soghomon Tehlirian is a saint. He's the assassin saint who brought justice and brought international law, brought the possibility for these kinds of atrocities to be adjudicated. Why would we undermine the hero's story? And I'm so grateful the family has embraced me, right? They are thrilled with what I'm doing. So, let me just tie it back to Christianity. As a Christian, this is my history. And there are 2.4 billion people that call themselves Christians on the planet that don't know their own history. 2.4 billion people identify as Christian. I'm not trying to cause war. I'm not trying to cause conflict. I'm trying to tell the truth, and the truth hurts. And so this is a Christian history that 2.4 billion people can get excited about it. And when they do, finally, Armenia will be recognized, and everybody will look at Armenia and want to go to Armenia and want to celebrate Armenia. And then they'll find out what's going on in Armenia right now. This is a story that will draw Christian eyes to their Christian heritage. The first Christian nation still has geographic territory. That's mind-boggling. You say that in a church today, they're like, what? The first Christian nation still exists, and it's shrinking, and we should pay attention to it by telling the hero's story. Why would you undermine that? Why would you want to? So, thank you so much, Mike. I got to go. My dinner's getting cold right here.
I should add one thing. I know Michael has to go.
You guys can continue.
Sure. I should add one thing thanks, Mike. I should add one thing, that telling a story based on religion versus what I believe it actually is, because Armenia today is in a hostile neighborhood that's not a Christian neighborhood. There's going to be a big target put onto Armenia by their neighbors, thinking that, oh, is that how it's supposed to be? It's Christian versus Muslim. Okay, well, we'll show them. So a lot of people have objected to using religion as the core for that. So
but the only thing is on that is that I think that we should try to do the same thing back, because at some point you take a look at even the Armenian heritage, the people that were Byzantine emperors, when Armenia went all the way from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, and what 85 BC or something to that effect. Armenia controlled the majority of all what we call Anatolia today. And, if you take a look at Armenian people, descents from people from Armenia, they would control most of, I think half the half the Byzantine Eastern Roman emperors have Armenian heritage, at some point. So, and then you take a look at Bulgaria and you take a look at some of these other countries too. They will have it married into Armenian heritage. And then you even take a look at the King of England and the Queen of England before him, his mom. They have Armenian heritage. So Princess Diana has Armenian heritage. Winston Churchill had Armenian heritage. We think we're a diaspora of only 10 million people, but if you take a look at all the people that have Armenian heritage, we'd probably be 100 million people. I think that somewhere down the line, we'd be better served if people start learning more about their history. And that's what I was trying to do tonight, is try to get 2 points of view. I think that if we tell the greater story, I think this is a good story. But the greater story would be is that who designed this, who sent this up, all that type of stuff. And we're just looking at at somebody who's a middle level type of person. I don't put it that way, but I think we need to dig deeper and find out, and then find out. Then we get to the point where, like you're saying, at that point, why was this not given the go-ahead by the authorities? Why was it put the kibosh after 6 or 7 executions? Why didn't they go to 100? That's a story I think that it should be told too. I mean, this idea of one person, but that one person that died could have really changed all of what we see today in Anatolia, for sure, because there would never have been a Turkish Republic in the end of October of 1923. Why did we do away with the Treaty of Sèvres and go into a Treaty of Lucerne? And then just, have you ever heard of a in history where the losing people can tear up a treaty and then get favorable terms?
I haven't.
This is something that we should start not scratching our head.
Even like we discussed before, the Treaty of Lucerne was a not legally binding treaty anyway.
Oh yeah,
because the people that had the territory never signed on that treaty, so they never surrendered the territory. So it made it occupied territory, and it made it illegal for them to take the minerals out.
Oh yeah, and then before they even their country, they go over and occupy parts of Western Armenia and never give that up, where the legal government said that they weren't supposed to do that, and they even had they were criminals under their legal government. So, and then all of a sudden they become the government. You cannot sign agreements and not be the legal standing of your government. This is kind of like George Washington promising something before he became president. It doesn't really cut the thing. So there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't make sense. And then today they go around and say, oh, it's internationally recognized, part of, Western Armenia is part of Turkey. But it's internationally recognized because people have been not told the truth.
Yeah. Well, and it's internationally recognized it's not legally binding anyway. That's just an political opinion. So it doesn't really mean anything. But people don't need to know the truth about that either.
No, and then just like we're talking to Mike earlier today, and he was saying about, and he has some very interesting things, would make a very interesting story. It's just not necessarily helpful to have a documentary or a story out there that would not necessarily include more of the truth. If that would, and then people make up their own mind, and that's one of the things we try to do when we do this, all these things on Educide, is that all you do is changing the narrative. And we see that today in some of the events that have taken place in the last month. Narratives are trying to change right before our eyes. Even today or in the last couple of weeks, they said that Donald Trump was the biggest threat to democracy or something to that effect. And then we see that the Democratic Party, I know you had run as a Democratic candidate before, but the Democratic Party was always to try to get the people to vote, and then they decide to vote on a Democratic candidate through the not even the smoke-filled room, just through the telephones, and stuff like that. So when you start throwing out stuff, you can throw out anything you want to, and then people will start believing it. And that's why it's really important for them to investigate yourself. And it's important to listen to people like Michael there and tell his story, to actually read your books.
I really need to forgot to mention this translator that Michael had used, Ishkan. I know him. He said that he compared 3 different writings of Soghomon Tehlirian, the Jailhouse Diaries, Soghomon's memoirs, and something else. I should note that Ishkan is not a forensic linguist. So in order for him to make any type of conclusion as a translator is irresponsible, because if you're going to try to do a comparison of texts, you need to hire an actual forensic linguist, and Ishkan is not a forensic linguist. So that again is just his opinion, but it's also, no one said that Soghomon was involved in the writing and didn't participate. But as Soghomon's son Soghomon Jr. said, and as Bedo said, the memoirs were left behind when they fled. And so something new was written, and a lot of things were removed, and a lot of things were added. And as it was said, half the stuff isn't true. So now you have to decide which half of the stuff isn't true. Is this half or this half? And why would a dream not be true or be true when something else is not true? It's very convoluted, the whole thing.
You mentioned something earlier in the conversation there, that dream is a very important part of his defense. The defense is trying to get him off of a murder charge. The Germans were very, at that point, they had just gotten it and been publishing for the last year or so all the pictures from that famous German photographer. The name escapes me right now, but he has taken all kinds of pictures all across the Ottoman Empire and shown about how grievous this was. A lot of Germans were very sympathetic. Remember, that was during the Weimar Republic, where you just had gone through some vivid things where the communists tried to take over. There was a lot of upheaval. A lot of people were having buyer's remorse over the war. There's a very strong belief that the Germans were actually sold out by their own people or their own leaders, or to try to get out of the war. Germany was still occupying part of France when the armistice took place. So a lot of people started looking at the idea that, hey, this had the United States doing that mass advertising campaign saying how bad the Huns were, and and they show guerrillas, and we're trying to dehumanize people and stuff like that. And Germany just actually went to war to help out their partners, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, when Franz Joseph was shot in Sarajevo. So legitimately, they probably had a reason to do what they did. I'm not trying to say that it was right or wrong, but places to go to. Woodrow Wilson runs in 1916, and he kept us out of the war, and that was his deal. He ends up carrying California by a very thin margin. That's how he wins the race. And then I believe he gets inaugurated in March of 1917. And then by April the 2nd, he has a speech in front of Congress to declare war over a submarine and the Zimmerman deal. Well, the submarine Lusitania was sunk in 15, so they go back to unrestricted warfare. It just very coincidental, the timing. I'll just put it that way. If he couldn't have done that before, because he wouldn't have won the presidency. So a lot of his politics, and you would know more about California than I would. He barely ekes out California, and he would have lost a lot of things if he wasn't an anti-war. He kept us out of war was a deal in California.
Yeah, one thing I will say also that I didn't mention for the trial, and this was brought up in another discussion, the possible reason also why it was a 2-day trial was not because they wanted to dispose of this. As Michael had said, there were a lot of assassinations going on at that time, and there were a lot of trials. So all those trials were very quick
Yeah.
and get it done and get it out. And that was mentioned in another discussion about the Soghomon Tehlirian trial. And there was an expert that did a lot of research. Her name is Osik. I can't remember her last name offhand right now, but she mentioned that she believes that may have been part of the reason why the trial was so short, was because there were a lot of executions, a lot of assassinations going on at the time, and they were just churning them through the courts. Otherwise, they didn't have time even. So, but I also do believe that the Germans wanted to get it out of their hair. They knew that they didn't want to bring up the Armenian question in the trial. That's very clear. And again, the attorneys that my grandfather hired, they were handpicked for various reasons, and one of them was they had influence over the judge and they had influence over the prosecutor. So that made a huge difference too for the acquittal. Now, whether he was found insane or not, that was their intention when they were trying to get an insanity, show that he was insane. And Shah Natali speaks about that in that 16-minute version of the recording that I played 5 minutes of.
Yeah, I think you probably hit a very good point when you're talking about that, because that definitely makes a large difference when it comes to that 2-day trial, and they had all the witnesses that they needed to set up their thing already there. That means that it had to be premeditated, which actually probably proves a point that the murder was premeditated as well. If they ever found out all this stuff, this doesn't just happen by accident. You're not in 1921 going to have enough people to do this and throw the thing to actually charge the victim for the crime. You know, that's basically what they end up doing. And
I can't comment really on whether the witnesses, it took them, was pre-set up or not. I don't believe it was. I think that those witnesses, there were enough people there that wanted to testify. People did come in to testify, and they had 2 months to get them together. So I do think that part was not, and there's nothing in my grandfather's archives that showed that they had witnesses lined up. They might have ended up killing. I mean, when Shahan went to Rome, he was expecting that he might run into Talaat, and if he had run into Talaat, he had a gun.
It would have happened then.
He was going to do it right there. He was prepared to actually execute Talaat in Rome had he run into him, because at the timing was they were coming back to power. The Armenians knew they were coming back to power, and they had to stop them before they could travel out of Germany. So there was even a period where the Turks didn't show up to the regular places, the cafes that they frequented, for a while. And then they found out that there was a reason why they hadn't, but the Armenians had thought, oh, shoot, they had already left, and now we're really in trouble. So that kind of put a panic in things. And so, yeah, no, my grandfather was prepared to be the Soghomon character had he run into Talaat in Rome, but Talaat had already left Rome. He had been there, and he was pretty much kicked out because the organizers of the meetings didn't want him to be there. He even wanted to speak at the conference. They wouldn't allow him because he was a wanted man at the time. But they were all in the process of bringing him back to power. That was what that conference was about. That was one of a couple conferences.
I'll try to finish on this a little bit. When I say it was planned, I'm thinking maybe it was planned from when the time of the murder until the time of the trial. In other words, I'm saying it was set up very quickly. They had this deal because just like JFK, it could have been in Chicago, it could have been Tampa, it could have been in Dallas or whatever. Different people, different parts, but some of the same things are going around, and you see this a lot in some of these different things like that. But just the fact that they were able to come up with that type of defense, that defense could have been universal in almost any sort of person, and it just changed the names around,
I should also add that some of the falsehoods in the memoir, which there's no reason to dispute them or to argue over them, but it is a falsehood, is Soghomon Tehlirian was brought in by Yeranuhi Danelian, who was the niece of General Antrane. They were of a different political party, And because the Dashnags were against the operation, Shahan had reached out to various people, and Yeranuhi Danelian is the one who knew Soghomon Tehlirian, who was there and actually was the person who told Soghomon Tehlirian about the Armenian trader in Istanbul who Soghomon executed in 1919 in his home from behind a plate glass window in the front. And so my grandfather had heard about this heroic act. One thing my grandfather didn't know, and I don't know if it's in the memoirs or not, but Soghomon was epileptic. And had he known that he was subject to seizures, he would have never taken Soghomon on as the executioner of Talaat. So Soghomon concealed that, and he fortunately did not have a seizure while he was doing the execution. One other thing is, Soghomon Jr., his son, told me that he did not shoot Talaat from behind, as Michael described. He shot him from up front, he said, and I heard that from my father himself, and I just said Talaat. So it wasn't, hey, Talaat. He never, I mean, that's the way that the son, but it doesn't really matter. He did say Talaat. Talaat turned to him. So Soghomon came from behind him. He said, Talaat. Talaat turned, looked him square in the eye, and Soghomon immediately shot. And he shot him from the front, not the back of the head.
Wow. Yeah. See, I think that
so there's a lot of little things. They're not super important for the story because at the end of the day, he shot him. I mean, that's
right. But it's kind of important because I think you get a bigger story, is what I'm trying to say. You know, sometimes you get so fixed into something that you want to make the facts fit your story. And in this case, you want to do the opposite. You want to tell the facts to tell the story. Does that make some sense?
Yes, absolutely.
And by having people watch this video, which would be kind of interesting, or to try to investigate this, or heaven help us that we be able to actually get a video or film out eventually. It would be better to tell the whole story and then let everybody find it out than it would be just to tell part of it. Because if we just tell it from his point of view, you're not going to get the whole story. You're not going to get the background. You're not going to get the richness of what you're going to do. You're not going to get the whole idea of what was going on, you know, the sense of justice. You're not going to get actually that Raphael Lemkin, you know, that influence there ends up going back to, we get the Genocide Convention of 48. And even today, while we have laws and while we're able to do this stuff, all goes back to the Armenian Genocide here. You know, and I think Michael brought up something like 1.5 million. It could have been 2 million. You know, there's no really telling how many people were actually, you know.
It could have also been much less. It doesn't matter. The intent was genocide at the end of the day. The number, it doesn't even matter. What does matter is that the intent was genocide, and it is an Armenian story. It is not, because there are Armenians who are not Christians. It's an Armenian story. So for a Christian to claim it as their story, that's kind of also a little disturbing, because it is an Armenian story, this particular one. And there are a lot of stories of genocide that are, you know, that Christians have been, I mean, Rwanda, the Christians were being prosecuted in Rwanda. They had Christians at the end of the day. So was that a religious one? I don't know. Was there oil involved? Yes, there was. Were the people who backed the Young Turks, backed the people who were carrying out the genocide? Yes, they were. Israel was backing the Rwandan genocide. So that's a fact. So all these genocides that we've been seeing, as Soghomon Jr. said, it's happening every day. You see it in the chronicles. Every page you turn, there's some atrocity. You know, 40 people, 200 people, whatever the case may be. And a lot of the times it leads back to the same big players, the ones that were after the oil. And it was the founders of Turkey, who also were the founders of Azerbaijan, who were also founders of the Ukraine, who are also founders of Israel and Kuwait and other places. And it's all over the globe. I mean, there are all these states that are internationally recognized, yet they occupy somebody else's legal territories, and they exploit their minerals illegally, which are subject to reparations.
And basically, all these neocons that want to have endless wars. That's the reason why they want endless wars, is to be able to make money on the minerals, make money on selling armaments, and then make money on rebuilding. So I mean,
And we're
they
seeing
make
it right
money.
now. $1.6 billion being shipped over to the Ukraine again. And that's our taxpayer dollars going there to support another war.
Yeah, and
it's happening in Palestine, and it's happening. It's the Middle East is on the verge of blowing up right now again.
This is a little inside politics part, but I just came back from Minnesota. We were at Nationals, and we stayed about 6-7 blocks south of the Capitol, and we'd walk up to the Capitol every day. And in the morning, I would go to a daily mass at a local church. And so we went to daily mass. I stood outside the door, and finally a couple of parishioners asked me, was I standing on guard? And it's kind of scary. There were a bunch of homeless people there, and right next to the doors there were a couple cigarette lighters. There's crack paraphernalia. You see people just crack pipes, all kinds of stuff. And you see syringes. Then come out of mass, somebody would be picking up all the stuff, and about an hour later, we're walking there to go to the venues where we're going to go do our moot courts. And sure enough, it's all there again. Our cities are in some really bad situations in which, instead of sending money overseas, we should be trying to spend money and try to help these poor people out. Well, I was thinking, and 2 years ago, I went to Minneapolis, and we were literally stepping over bodies of people. I saw people being thrown off of trains that were smoking crack in the middle of a train, and the transit police come out and pull them off. I grew up in Minneapolis, St. Paul area. Downtown area was nice. I would ride a bicycle 15 miles from suburbs downtown, all kinds of cool stuff. Of course, I'm a little bit older, so that seemed like it was a long time ago. But just to think the way our cities have gone, and then to take somebody like and put him on the ticket to run for president, and say that he's doing such a great job in Minnesota, we should be ashamed of ourselves. We should take care of America before we start sending money overseas to these other people and telling them what to do. We say that we're a democracy, and then we put sanctions on people and do all kinds of harm, and then we do the same thing that we accuse these other people of doing. This is not America where I was raised when I was young. It's not America. I think that we should get to our grandchildren, great grandchildren, or whatever. We need to wake up a little bit, don't you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see the same stuff you're talking about here in California. It's no better. It's probably worse. And we have areas that it's just everyone's, using drugs to forget about what's going on, and crime is on the rise. So sadly, this is our current reality. And like you said, we shouldn't be supporting wars. We support more than 800 military bases all over the world in 80 different countries, and over 100 in Germany alone. So we got a lot to do, and politicians aren't up for the task. Humanity has to step up to the plate.
And I think all you got to do is look at Armenia where you see politicians, because like Mike was trying to say, he didn't understand why Armenians are fighting, but oh my gosh, all you got to do is look at Parliament in Armenia. I've never seen so many, and Armenia's been full, all throughout Armenian history, has always been infighting, cousins fighting cousins or whatever. You can't get agreement, but they need to be on the same page or there won't be an Armenia left.
Yeah, sadly.
And maybe that's the lesson we should learn from this, is that we should all try to get together and try to tell the whole story instead of parts of the story, and then it would be much better. I would love to see a world in which you could fit into with him. They could tell a whole story, and then maybe people would be able to understand exactly what took place then and why we need to do something different, and we need to do it yesterday, not tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm very passionate about that, but I don't know. I'm sorry. Hopefully, people get to see, make up your own mind. I think these are very troubled times we lived in, heaven's sakes, we're talking about very troubled times back in those days. But I don't think you need to find the truth, and you need to investigate yourself. And one of the best ways to do is get Betrayal. And Ari's coming out with a new book, and the new book's title is what?
Memoirs of a Stranger. That's Shahan Natali's book. And then there's another one called Mandate for Global Peace. It's a short book, easy read, and gives us an idea of where we are today, how we got here, and what we as individual humans can do to make a difference.
Oh, good. And we're going to try to next month get a hold of a couple of Armenian politicians, and we're going to talk a little bit about some foreign policy and stuff. So maybe if my connections from AGBU come through, we will be able to discuss a little bit about some foreign policy, because I've been reading about the United States right now, talking about we're going to have some promises if we're going to try to get peace between the Azerbaijan and Armenia. And I don't know about you, but I think we have some people that need to be reading some books, because this idea of giving up land for peace has never worked. You can't give up your country to save it. You can't tax yourself into rich. You know, you can't you can't borrow yourself into being rich, and you can't give away your land and keep your country. So we have some people who are just really trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. So I'd like to see if we could talk with them. Thank you so much for tonight, and we will see you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for having me. Good night.
I'll send you the video.
You got it. Thanks.